Hello, this is HIST 141, U.S. History since 1877. I'm Derek Taylor, and this is our lecture on the New Deal. So I'll title it New Deal, New Republic, America Against the Great Depression, 1929 to 1939. In this lecture, we're going to talk about how the New Deal and how FDR, in the process of trying to combat the Great Depression, really does reshape I think a majority of Americans' ideas of what the federal government anyway should be doing for the country, and as a result of this crisis. Let's dive into this. Left off last time talking about the Great Depression as it just hit, and it went down pretty quickly. U.S. gross domestic product would drop by half between 1929 and 1932, from 103 billion to 58 billion. Consumption dropped by 18%, construction dropped by 78%, private investment dropped almost 90%. 15 million people, a nation of about 120 or so, were unemployed by 1933. Many of those took wage cuts to keep their jobs. Those that were down and out did whatever they could to survive. If you ever sometimes see this in films, but people, become hobos, ride the trains, going around looking for work, for food or whatever. But I should say that the Great Depression did not devastate the entire country. The middle class did not disappear, and the rich were just fine. So it was not something that affected everyone, definitely not equally. And in fact, in terms of, there were regional variations. The South fared much better than the rest of the nation because it lacked heavy industry, which experienced a much steeper downturn. Bank failures were concentrated in the Midwest and the Great Plains. Black men suffered twice the unemployment rate of white men in the northern cities and southern states. So there were differences because of this. The other thing that's pertinent about life in the Great Depression is that in earlier eras, the first line of defense against poverty had always been private charity, particularly religious organizations. When in 1931, these services have become overwhelmed, and which kind of makes sense. You now have an urban society. Most people live in cities. It's pretty clear by this point that the rural areas are more religious than the big cities. They don't have that maybe as much in those areas, and so they're overstretched. And the government at this point did nothing really for public support for the elderly. Federal government, I mean. Few Americans had retirement savings. People did what they could. They adjusted. They delayed marriage, reduced the number of children they had. The marriage rate fell to a statistical low during the Depression, while the birth rate dropped from 97 births per 1,000 women to 75 by 1933. And nonetheless, one thing to note about all this, in spite of all this, despite some high-profile crime sprees during the 1930s, there was no significant spike in crime rates during the Depression. Even, in fact, crime rates even went down over the long term. Likewise, there appears to be no great rise in death rates either, and little evidence that people were starving in mass numbers. This was not necessarily life and death. It just was terrible on a large scale. And what happens, of course, that makes this even worse is that this spread to the rest of the globe. And it was worse to a large degree elsewhere. And I should mention again, I mentioned how the United States, when its banks fell in my last lecture, this caused a wave of banks failing in Europe. I want to speak about something really quickly here. Why America was so tied into the economy of Europe. If you recall, after World War I, the Allies forced Germany to pay reparations. Well, in 1923, the Germans blocked France from collecting reparations, and the French sent an army into Germany, into the Ruhr area of Germany, to occupy, to get the German government to pay up its reparations for World War I. The Germans resisted by general strikes, passive resistance, but also by doing things like printing money, which is never a good idea. And the result was inflation went insane. It wiped out pretty much the value of any paper money in the country. People's pensions, annuities, insurance plans, savings accounts, all were wiped out by 1923. The entire middle class lost everything. So then to this catastrophe, the United States stepped in And a banker, an American banker named Charles Dawes, came up with a plan whereby the French would evacuate the Ruhr area. The reparations would be lowered so the Germans could more easily pay for them. And the Germany would borrow money from the US, who would thereby be able to make payments to France and Britain, who would use that money to pay their own debts to the United States, which they've had from World War I. So you have this sort of cockamamie scheme where we're paying the Germans to pay the British and the French to pay us back. But it worked for a while. Growth picked up by 1929. Most of Europe had reached pre-war levels of industrial production and things like this. But the Depression wiped all that out. And just to give you an idea of this, worldwide manufacturing fell by 40%. International trade fell by 66%. At one point in Germany, 30 million people were unemployed, 25% of the country. While in certain areas, for example, coastal areas of Europe, the UK, for example, they saw unemployment as high as 90% because there's no more international trade. So it was really dire in certain places. Moreover, this brought a sort of insecurity to people in these new governments. And it led to governments across Europe and the United States, as you'll see as part of this, the New Deal, to try to provide work for people, try to lessen market uncertainties, and increase self-sufficiency. In other words, what we call economic nationalism. I mentioned this partly because this was something that he talked about, never did Donald Trump. He did pass tariffs. That's something he did against the Chinese, but virtually nothing else. But it was a lot more than that in the 1930s. And the United States engaged in this. England got off the gold standard. Eventually, we did as well under Roosevelt, which I'll get to in a moment. But even in the early part of the Great Depression, countries were actually bartering with each other. Brazil traded coffee for American steel. Germany traded cameras for pork from Yugoslavia. So you have these tariffs going up everywhere. You have people adopting quotas, limits on imports. Governments began to require more control, more planning. And so you have this sort of economic tensions breeding into nationalism. Again, this is going to feed into World War II, which is why I mentioned it. But it's part of this retrenchment before, because you had this freewheeling democracy and free market economy led to a bust. People began to react against it, as they have, of course, in the recent past. And here's a depiction, a map of a percentage of families on relief from 1933. And you can kind of see again where it hits the worst: upper Midwest, South, parts of the West. Other areas not as affected by this, but definitely uneven in its effects in the United States. As we come to Herbert Hoover, I need to mention Hoover. I want to make a contrast between him and Roosevelt, because Hoover is kind of a bureaucrat. I call him the managerial president. He's actually an interesting guy. You'll read an excerpt from him in Major Problems, which is, I think, makes some good points to a certain degree. Hoover was from Iowa, grew up poor, made himself into an engineer and geologist, graduated from Stanford. In fact, an interesting guy. He is the only, this is a fun fact, it's a trivia fact you can impress your friends with. He is the only US president ever to speak fluently Chinese, Mandarin Chinese. He ran a gold mine in China before the revolution there. So that's why. But yeah, an interesting guy and very capable. When World War I broke out, he led the international effort to ship food to Belgium. During World War I, when we got into it, he headed Wilson's U.S. Food Administration, which fed the troops in Europe, made them well fed, and made sure people back home never felt any effects of all the rationing that went on, because we were under ration stuff for the war effort. So an interesting guy, fairly principled, intelligent, but he was a technocrat, and one whose personality was kind of dour and not a very openly affectionate man. Point is, he's not the kind of guy in an emergency people are going to trust. And you combine that with his defense of what we call voluntarism. This is one of the reasons why he becomes so hated. As the Depression continued, he continued to insist on a couple of things Americans had always believed, actually, one of which is what's called, which is that the idea that economic outcomes were the responsibility of individual effort, that you're responsible for your own, economic well-being. If you lost your savings, that's because of your responsibility. And again, this is sound kind of cruel, but again, it's part of a tradition of American sort of Republican ideology of independence, right? To be dependent on someone else, economically speaking, is shameful. That's why a lot of people to this day cannot go on. I know people who, not personally, I know of people who, when their business goes under and they lose everything, they literally commit suicide because it's just the most horrible thing in the world. Powerful thing. The other thing is he believed in was voluntarism. And voluntarism is the idea that the business community could regulate itself. And in fact, Hoover had been warning since 1923 that there would be a downturn in the economy. So again, he's not someone who's totally irresponsible. And even he recognized that this voluntarism might not be enough. Quickly, soon after the stock market crashed, he cut federal taxes, tried to boost private investment. He called on state and local governments to increase spending on public works. In 1931, he secured an increase of $700 million in federal spending on public works. But his most innovative program, which actually was extended and taken over by Roosevelt's New Deal, was the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which in 1932 basically provided federal loans to railroads, banks, and other institutions to build things. The plan might have worked, but the RFC didn't lend money in enough volume to do anything, apparently. Congress allocated $1.5 billion to it, but they only expended 20% of these funds by the end of 1932 when he got voted out of office. And the point of all this is that Hoover actually did a lot compared with previous presidents. And definitely in contrast to his popular image, which was very negative. People hated his guts. They blamed him for people's woes. He responded to this crisis with unprecedented government action, but it didn't fail to meet people's outcry, though. And so rising discontent will doom Herbert Hoover is the point. You'll have people, again, they invent terms, Hoovervilles, shanty towns that people lived in packing crates. Hoover blankets, newspapers, which were introduced into the American vocabulary because of people's, I won't say scapegoating, but they're laying the blame all on him. And, labor strikes still occurred during the Depression, despite the threat that strikers would lose their jobs. Veterans staged the most publicized protest of the Depression. If I know the story, in the summer of 1932, a bonus army of 15,000 unemployed World War I veterans marched on Washington to demand an immediate disbursement of their bonuses. They were supposed to wait several more years, but they wanted it now because they were suffering. And what happened was General Douglas MacArthur, without Hoover's authorization, by the way, because you had 15,000 camped on the mall outside of Washington, MacArthur gave the order to clear the men from the city. And so you had these newsreels of the U.S. Army driving tanks to drive its own veterans out of D.C. and crushing their makeshift homes they put up there. It basically it sunk whatever chance he had at being reelected, and he was duly destroyed in 1932 by FDR, by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And even as FDR took office, the Depression kind of reached its nadir by March of 1933. Nation's banking system was almost close to total collapse. State governors closing banks temporarily to avoid further withdrawals. It was basically a mess. There you can actually see one of these Hoovervilles from the time period. So, and so again, to contrast with Hoover, and this is kind of important, Franklin D. Roosevelt is a much different figure. Unlike Hoover, who grew up poor, Roosevelt came from a wealthy, prominent family. Really kind of, as far as we can have these things in the United States, really kind of an aristocrat. He was from the Roosevelt clan, distantly related, distant cousin of Theodore Roosevelt. The Roosevelts themselves, I mean, that's Dutch, goes back to the colonial period. New York was originally founded by the Dutch. Born to wealth, went to Harvard, did 2 years of law school at Columbia, but never took a degree. He did not have a great intellectual aptitude, but he was very charming, gregarious, outgoing, and he quickly rose to the ranks of the Democratic Party. During World War I, he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, the same position TR had actually occupied at one point. Still, many people thought of him as being an intellectual lightweight. Walter Lippmann, the philosopher and journalist, declared that Roosevelt was, quote, a pleasant man without any important qualifications for the office, would very much like to be president, unquote. And Lippmann's a guy of the left, man of the left, by the way. Oliver Wendell Holmes had an apocryphal statement, which I don't think was actually about TR, but sometimes attributed to being about him, said that he had, quote, a second-class mind and a first-class temperament, which is cruel and kind of beside the point, because despite all this, Roosevelt had a coherent political vision or philosophy and the ability to communicate that philosophy clearly to a wide audience. And in that, by the way, he is very similar to one of his successors, someone you wouldn't normally compare because their policies were so different, and that would be Ronald Reagan. That's right, the great tax cutter himself. Both had that ability to communicate things really clearly and simply to people. And they had a vision which was, you know, again, could fit into that sort of communication. Like Reagan, Roosevelt was a charmer with reporters. He made great use of the medium of radio, as we'll see in a second. Ronald Reagan, of course, was a former actor. Ronald Reagan once famously said that he didn't know how anyone could be president without having been an actor, in fact. And like Reagan, Roosevelt had an infectious optimism about him. And in both cases, Roosevelt and Reagan, both due to difficulties in their lives, adversity they had to overcome. Reagan's father was an alcoholic. It was a deeply shameful thing for him. He kind of developed I would say, fairly rose-colored glasses about the world, especially about his country. Very patriotic, loved his country, as did Roosevelt. His ordeal was much different. Roosevelt in 1921 suffered an attack of polio, left both of his legs paralyzed, and yet he emerged from this a stronger, more resilient person, someone who also, I think, saw the world through kind of rose-colored glasses. But he was the kind of person that people, I think, needed to hear in an emergency like this. And there you can kind of see, that's a picture of him. I didn't think this on purpose. You can find plenty of pictures where he's dressed like an ordinary guy, but this is him. This is the patrician populist, someone who really did care about the people, but came from the upper classes. I think that's a decent way of talking about FDR. Now, he promised during his election the country would get a New Deal if he were elected. And the first, and as soon as he got into office, and remember back then, presidents weren't sworn in until March, so he was raring to get go. So in the first 100 days, his administration with a Democratic Congress passed a ton of legislation. That's why for a long time, I think even to this day, people will still talk about the first 100 days of a president's office. And he established a close rapport with American people by the use of radio, his so-called fireside chats. I'll play a couple of these in a second. That fostered a sense of intimacy. And again, this interesting thing about him, and this is not unique, and I'm not suggesting anything untoward about him. He did have his critics who compared him, because he increased the power of the federal government, to fascist and communist leaders in Europe, and he did, like those fascists and communists, also did make use of things like radio and film. Again, this is kind of not just it's not the property of any one political side in the 1930s. Pretty much every government which is trying to be more populist at this point makes use of these medium, but he does it very, very well. And it basically expands the sort of role of the executive branch in initiating policy, using his charisma to do this and extend what his predecessor TR did in some ways. And as well, he resurrects in his legislation progressivism, which had been gone for the better part of the 1920s since Wilson. Comes back with a vengeance. In particular, he relies on a brain trust of professors. Brain trust is what they called it, from professors from Columbia, Harvard, and other Ivy League universities. And so you have the triumph of progressive emphasis on scientific expertise in government coming to the fore, which has never really went away. So this is a big change. And 15 major bills were enacted in the first 100 days. It targeted 4 areas of the economy: banking failures, agricultural overproduction. You had actual farmers during the Depression destroying their crops because they couldn't get enough money for them. Long story short, the business slump and soaring unemployment. His opponents derided this raft of legislation as alphabet soup because of all the abbreviations they spawned: CCC, the WPA, the AAA, and so on and so forth, as well as the policies and agencies that represented at the beginning of a new state, one much more aggressive. The first problem he tackled was the banking crisis. The president declared a national bank holiday, called Congress into special session. That got them to pass an emergency banking act, which permitted banks to reopen, but only if a Treasury Department inspection showed they had sufficient cash reserves. And in his first fireside chat, the president reassured citizens that banks were safe. When the banks reopened, there were more deposits than withdrawals. So his speech was really important. Again, he was really good at doing that, was Roosevelt. They passed the banking law, the Glass-Steagall Act, which created the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which insured deposits up to a certain point. He removed, did Roosevelt, the U.S. Treasury from the gold standard, which helped lower interest rates. Congress also passed the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which established a system for 7 major commodities: wheat, cotton, corn, hogs, rice, tobacco, and dairy products, that provided cash subsidies to farmers who cut production in hopes the prices would rise. In a sort of trend, though, about a lot of this legislation, a lot of these benefits were not distributed evenly. Subsidies primarily went to the owners of large and medium-sized farms, while renters and sharecroppers received few dollars in relief. And again, this is part of the problem when you work at an economy of scale. You wind up favoring the bigger companies, which happens again with the National Industry Recovery Act of 1933, which established a system of self-governing private associations in a bunch of industries. And these associations were supposed to establish prices and production quotas. But large companies tended to dominate the NRA's code drafting process, which again solidified the power of larger companies at the expense of smaller ones. He also passed he also created the Federal Emergency Relief Administration in 1933 to offer federal money to the states for relief programs. In 1920, he also founded the Civil Works Administration, which put 2.5 million men and women to work. At its peak, it employed 4 million people in public works jobs. A more long-term program, the Civilian Conservation Corps, mobilized 250,000 men to do reforestation and conservation work. And they built bridges, roads, trails, and other structures in state and national parks. Then finally, more than 500,000 Americans lost their homes between 1930 1932. In response, Congress created the Homeowners Loan Corporation to refinance home mortgages. In just 2 years of operation, it helped more than 1 million Americans retain their homes. And so you have a raft of legislation meant to sort of alleviate the worst aspects of the New Deal, of the Great Depression. And I think, as we're going to suggest, and we'll go on this later on, this at the bare minimum does one thing. It shows people that the government is actually doing something about the Great Depression, even if, as you're going to see, it doesn't necessarily end the crisis. And here's just a map of the country and where you have civilian conservation corps camps, where they're at. And notice, by the way, they're mostly in those states, upper Midwest and South, where the devastation, economically speaking, was worse. And of course, you have national parks as well. So makes sense. And this is people working on the Grand Coulee Dam, what year does it say what year that is, but the 1930s, obviously, for the New Deal. Putting people to work. Here, I just want to play, I won't play all of these. These are some of his fireside chats. You actually find this stuff on the internet pretty easily, but I picked out a few for you. I want to play this for you, give you an idea. When I say he's Roosevelt's charisma had a lot to do with the getting the confidence of the American people back, despite the fact his programs didn't necessarily work all that well. I want to play for you his fireside chat number 1. This is on the banking crisis, so listen to this, fairly short. Oh, I didn't do that. Okay, that didn't work. Oops. Yeah, I don't want to prolong this any more than we have to. I don't know if you could hear that. If you sat through that, there was nothing. I apologize, but do listen to some of the. If you can listen to at least the banking crisis one, you can get a sense of what kind of person he was. Now, I want to show you this. This is again. Hopefully, you can hear this. Oh, so didn't quite get that. Yeah, this is a little motion picture featurette done by Hollywood at the behest of the Roosevelt administration, which was the first administration, by the way, to get sort of in bed with Hollywood. The Hollywood types liked him. So, but give you an idea of just kind of the use of film. Let's see if we can do this. What way it plays. Oh, I guess it didn't go. Anyway, I don't want to waste any more time, but do take a look at the video. It's embedded in the file. It's worth looking at to give you an idea of how it is kind of a propaganda push by FDR, a successful one, I might add. In any case, his first few years are sort of a rush of success. However, by 1934, you begin to have people getting tired of this, of the excessive, interference in government. Business leaders and conservative Democrats formed the Liberty League in 1934 to lobby against the New Deal and what it called its reckless spending, quote unquote, and socialist reforms. And you have to remember something, that's a very dangerous charge to make at that time, given the hostility to socialism and communism, which there is, by the way, sympathy with communism in the Democratic Party at that point, especially even among some of FDR's advisors. Moreover, he's going to start to get a lot of pushback from the Supreme Court. In a case called Schechter versus the United States, the Supreme Court ruled that the National Industrial Recovery Act represented an unconstitutional delegation of legislative power to the executive branch and struck it down. So this is one of his key aspects of the New Deal. But even more urgent challenges came from the left. You had people like Father Charles Coughlin, who was, of all things, a Catholic priest who had his own radio show, had a radio following, who organized something called the National Union for Social Justice to attack the New Deal and demand nationalization of the banking system and an expansion of the money supply. Remember, expanding the money supply is a populist idea from much of the 1890s. He was popular. He was also racist and anti-Semitic, but fiercely anti-communist. He was, by the way, eventually disciplined by the Catholic Church for a lot of reasons. But he was not as big of a threat to him as some others because he was Canadian-born and a priest, so he wasn't able to run for president. The most direct threat came from a really very colorful figure, Senator Huey Long of Louisiana. 1934, Long broke with Roosevelt and the New Deal and established his own national movement, the Share Our Wealth Society. And Long himself is kind of a character worth investigating. So one of these corrupt Louisiana politicians called himself the Kingfish. Oh, there is the Kingfish. I'll come back to that in a second. I guess yeah, no, we're going all the wrong way here. I guess we can get on Huey Long. There's Huey Long, who I keep on top of my head, but some of his actual reforms were copied by Roosevelt in the coming years. Again, the point is he's as these attacks mount on his New Deal, Roosevelt's kind of forced to move to the left. That's Huey Long. One last thing, that's Father Charles Coughlin giving a speech in the 1930s. It's as a result of this shift to the left that what we think of as the welfare state comes into being. In 1936, he basically moves away from directly attacking the depression to expanding, you might say, well, to extending the state in order to give the left what it wanted, effectively. After the Supreme Court struck down the National Recovery Act in 1935, Congress passed the Wagner Act in 1935, which upheld the right of industrial workers to join a union, and it established the National Labor Relations Board to protect workers' rights, so they could appeal to it against these big companies. So he moves left on labor. There are a lot of strikes, as I'll show you in a moment, during the 1930s. That's one of the reasons why he's being pushed toward this. But his most lasting piece of legislation has to be the Social Security Act of 1935. This is for the first time the federal government provided pensions for most workers in the private sector, financed by a federal tax that both employers and employees would pay, and established a joint federal state system of unemployment compensation. It basically is the beginning of the welfare state. The federal government had never really assumed that type of responsibility for the well-being of its citizens, or a large portion of them before, until then. Established that principle. And this is why historians, they sometimes talk about this second act, if you will, second part of his second term, as being a second New Deal, and the creation of what's called New Deal liberalism or welfare liberalism. It's a break from what was called classical liberalism. Remember, classical liberalism held that individual liberty was the foundation of a democratic society. This is more or less what Herbert Hoover believed. But Roosevelt and his advisors basically redefined that idea. In their mind, they were trying to preserve individual liberty through government assistance. It'll eventually reshape the idea totally in many ways, but it's the beginning of this process, and still with us today, obviously. This is just a map of all the different protests, strikes, organizations, political organizations from about 1929 on or 1930 onward, as you can see, all over the place. All over the place up until the end of the 1930s. So that's the reason why Roosevelt moved to the left in the latter part of his second term. And again, here's your government poster, advertising for Social Security. The widow of a qualified worker will receive monthly benefits at age 65. In certain cases, an age-dependent parent may get benefits. So again, helping your elderly people out again. And that is in generally a good thing, but you can see how it's a response to people's insecurities. However, this transformation of liberalism comes to an end by the end of the 1930s. You had people, again, he wins re-election in 1936 very easily. But he was afraid, Roosevelt was, that his reforms might be thrown out by the Supreme Court. So in 1937, he began stumping for fundamental changes in the Supreme Court. Only 2 weeks after his inauguration in 1937, he proposed the addition of one new justice for each sitting justice over the age of 70, which would have increased the number of justices from 9 to 15. Roosevelt claimed that he wasn't hearing enough cases, but his opponents, I think rightly, protested he was trying to pack the court with justices who favored the New Deal. I mentioned this because people have mentioned this recently in the last couple of years about wanting to pack the Supreme Court so they can get their way legislatively speaking. This is a terrible idea. It eventually came back against him. He was shot down. The sitting Supreme Court justices did not take kindly to this. However, he got what he wanted anyway, because a series of justices on the court resigned and then died. And so he was able to appoint favorable judges to the court. However, what really brought an end to the New Deal was the recession of 1937, 1938, which basically undid every good thing that had been done up till 1937. The recession, I think it spiked unemployment back up to 19%. It basically, they tried everything and nothing really worked. Roosevelt, as it happens, once the Second World War starts, will spend his way out of the downturn, and his advisors are groping toward an idea of deficit spending in order to stimulate the economy. I'll talk about this in a moment. This is one of the ideas that emerges from the Second World War and the Great Depression. And by the end of the 1930s, whatever other innovations are being opposed by a coalition of Southern Democrats and rural Republicans. And so whatever social reforms he might have made, it's all taken over and then swallowed up by World War II. But the New Deal is, again, has a lot more impact than just on politics and economics. Well, first thing it does is it reshapes the Democratic coalition. Before, it had been mostly white ethnics in the cities of the North, Irish Americans, Germans, and then whites in the South. One of the things that's going to happen is that labor will come on board, especially. Labor unions will grow dramatically in the 1930s. This is a huge shift. They win the battle for recognition, higher wages, grievance procedures. The Congress of Industrial Organizations, which eventually will merge with the AFL later on, will serve as the cutting edge of the union movement, promotes industrial unionism, which is the organizing of all workers in one industry, both skilled and unskilled, into one union. It used its influence to elect candidates that were sympathetic to labor. And despite all this, you're still going to have opposition to labor unions at the same time, which is interesting, though, because you also have sympathy with the USSR at an all-time high in the 1930s. And in fact, the American Communist Party, you'll read a selection by an American Communist Party leader in Major Problems. It has its heyday during the Depression. This is probably a response to its popularity. The other major reshaping of the coalition, later on, it'll become the sort of coalition of minorities that emerged in the 1960s does have its basis here. But the big shift is that even though, for the most part, most New Deal programs didn't necessarily affect Blacks that much, didn't help them that much, you did have a massive shift. Blacks had voted Republican since the Civil War, but in 1936, Blacks outside the South gave Roosevelt 71% of their votes. And they did this partly because even those programs that weren't specifically aimed at them helped poorer Americans. They tended to be the poorest. And so that was the beginning of what has maintained ever since, is that African Americans vote in overwhelming numbers for the Democratic Party. So major shift in that regard. At the same time, and also the New Deal expands federal responsibilities to include conservation. Again, some of this has been done by TR earlier on, but and the long-term success of all this is it's a mixed bag, but it stressed, again, scientific management of the land, conservation as opposed to commercial development, and the use of public authority, federal authority, to preserve and improve the natural environment. Partly spurred, of course, by the Dust Bowl. You had severe drought afflicting the Midwest, Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Kansas. So you're going to have people moving from the Midwest, places like California. This is where you get Okies, people from Oklahoma moving out there to California. This is the subject of John Steinbeck's novel, The Grapes of Wrath. Which, by the way, if you've ever read it, John Steinbeck's novel, he was a New Dealer. It's basically New Deal propaganda. Literally, they go out, by the end of the novel, the Joad family, which is the subject of the novel, they find themselves in one of these New Deal, like, I think it's a WPA or something, work camps. And yeah, it's basically propaganda for the New Deal, but definitely a great book. And you also have focus on things like land management, um, Soil Conservation Service, the Department of Agriculture will, try to teach farmers the proper technique for tilling hillsides, prevent erosion, stuff like this. Government agronomists try to prevent soil erosion through better agricultural practices, windbreaks, stuff like this. The biggest thing they attempted and was successful was the Tennessee Valley Authority. It integrated flood control, reforestation, and agricultural and industrial development, and built a hydroelectric grid to provide cheap power for the residents of the Tennessee Valley, River Valley. As you'll see, this brought electricity to thousands of people who never had it before. Also created the CCC created cabins, shelters, picnic areas, lodges in American state parks. Built in a government rustic style, which I have to say, we'll get to this in a moment. I actually kind of like New Deal architecture to a certain degree. Here's just the map of the Dust Bowl, where it was set, where it occurred, and places of wind erosion in the 1930s. And here is a map of the Tennessee Valley Authority, which again, 20 years basically building this. And again, you can kind of see where it built it, the places it built it in, rural areas. Again, think about it for a second, by the way. His base wasn't necessarily in rural areas, but the things benefited people there in the South. And so again, that's that, when I say he's a patrician populist, this is what I mean by that when I say populist. He did actually help people lower down the social scale, at least to a certain degree, did Roosevelt. And then finally, the New Deal really also encouraged artists to create projects that would be, well, kind of populist for the entire community, not just the elite. Art for the millions was the phrase they used for this. And they encouraged the painting of murals in public buildings. Like I said, they actually built, federal, public buildings, government buildings, stuff like this for the masses, which were actually decent looking. They weren't ugly or hideous. They weren't some brutalist, modernist monstrosity. And again, I stress this not to say there's anything bad about this. This is the same thing that's being done in European countries that are going fascist and communist. Again, it's populism, if you want to put it that way, to just draw a parallel. They created something called the Federal Art Project, which gave work to young artists, some of whom would come out of this, like painters and sculptors like Jackson Pollock. The Federal Music Project and Federal Writer Project, over 15,000 musicians and 5,000 writers found work. They did things like go around and write down the life stories of former slaves who were still alive. They, would go out and record folk music, that had never been written down before, stuff like this. And it was meant to be for the people. Of course, it's also advertising and propaganda for the government. But it is this kind of part and parcel of this new idea that the federal government should do that sort of thing. And so it's definitely a shift. And this is a face of some of the migrant camps in California by the New Deal photographers. This is also one of the things they did. Dorothea Lange, famous photo, of course, wife and her mother and her children. And one of the things that came out of that New Deal experiment in the arts. And then finally, this is an artist. This is also propaganda of a certain sort. The Promise of the New Deal, 1938, Roosevelt Arts Project. You can kind of see on one side, you see, stuff being built, garment workers union, buildings over here, people being educated, going to school there. You have an African American family up here. You have surveyors down there building stuff. You're planning Jersey homesteads. You're planning, government planning. Right? Scientific. We're scientific, and therefore you can trust us. And you have notice you have a co-op up here. Notice the poster of FDR up in the corner. A gallant leader, Franklin D. Roosevelt. You couldn't get more propaganda than that, but it is a nice piece of artwork. But it gives you a sense of again, trying to make the whole country one country by trying to include everybody. I'll come back to this point at the end of the lecture. That is, I think, one of the legacies of the New Deal. One of the things, and this, by the way, there are two sort of economic theories dealing with economic crisis that came out of the 1930s, but still shape how we debate the effectiveness of the New Deal. And these two names will be on your exam: John Keynes and Friedrich Hayek. John Keynes, I should say, and Friedrich Hayek. John Maynard Keynes was a British economist who had been at the Versailles Peace Conference in 1919. And he thought that underemployment was the biggest problem posed by the Great Depression. And in 1936, he published a book called The General Theory of Employment, which laid out his solution. He basically thought that wages fell as profits fell. Wages would fall as profits fell, and that hiring new workers would always be the last step that a business would take when recovering from an economic downturn. In his mind, only direct government action in the form of government spending and the creation of public works programs would allow wages earned by workers to be spent more readily, which would boost demand for products and services, thereby inducing a return to normal prices and profits for businesses. In other words, the whole point is to get workers more money so they can spend it more for products, so companies can produce more, et cetera, et cetera. The opposing view came from Friedrich Hayek, who was an Austrian economist, who challenged Keynes's theory in the 1940s. And he championed what was essentially a classical liberal view of economics. In his view, personal liberty and responsibility, and the rights of property, were paramount in making the economy work. And in his mind, government intervention to make it work will inevitably backfire. And what Hayek was really up in arms about was central planning. He really was opposed to that as much as anything else, because he thought that businessmen and entrepreneurs on the ground in the actual locales where businesses were being built and doing business had information, specific information that central planners simply could not have. The central planners could not go to all the areas they wanted to make their things work and have all this individual knowledge. In his mind, it's these individual businesses and these individual areas working together that makes the economy work. Free markets give people maximum latitude to do this. Centrally planned economic schemes don't, since they try to artificially stabilize prices, et cetera, et cetera. Hayek moved from Austria to Britain in the 1940s and began to observe there British socialists advocating many policies that were very similar to what the Nazis had been doing in Nazi Germany. And he began writing against Keynesian economics in the 1940s as a political matter. He wrote a book in 1944, it's sort of like the gospel for like libertarian types, called The Road to Serfdom, in which he argued that large-scale intervention in the economy is the first step on the road to totalitarianism. Fun fact, John Maynard Keynes read the book and was an admirer of it, which makes no sense. But anyway, these are the two sort of, basic ideas you should need to know for your exam. But the second thing is, of course, did this actually work? Did the New Deal with its programs, with increased spending, actually bring us out of the Great Depression? As far as I can tell, most historians don't believe that it did this. It probably contributed to easing some people's burdens, but they normally credit the war with increasing industrial production and hence ending the Depression and putting people back to work. There are, of course, conservative critics who make the case that the New Deal didn't do much of anything for the economy and perhaps made the Depression even worse. I don't know if this is true, the criticisms, but even if it was, it kind of misses one important point, and this is my point, is that people wanted to know that the government was trying to do something for them in the Great Depression. And Roosevelt's programs, did anything or not, did anything or not, at the very least projected the message that yes, your leaders actually care about your well-being. And that's why he was so popular. That's why he's still very popular today amongst historians. I believe whenever you hear historians, it's either one or two people. It's either Lincoln or FDR. But I think it's FDR. You poll historians, they ask who's the greatest president. It's usually him. And their evaluation of him, I think, extends for that. He did bring them uplift, and it did work. But this way, it made them believe in their government after the sort of, skepticism they had toward toward Hoover and his policies. The other thing that's, of course, important about the New Deal is that it begins the ballooning of the administrative state. The modern administrative state comes into being with the New Deal, with his love for program making, with his love for intellectuals to run these programs. You have what one historian calls the managerial revolution taking hold in government. Just as by early 20th century, large corporations had been using managerial experts, quote unquote, to run their corporations. So now you have a much greater investment on the part of the federal government, not only on intellectual experts, such as those of FDR's brain trust, economists, people like that, but also press handlers and those diviners of public opinion, pollsters. It was in the 1930s that the first public research institutes were founded. And it's not until 1940, in fact, the word poll, go back, the word poll referred mostly to elections, not surveys of opinion. But after 1940, it means polling the people for their opinion, not voting. It's probably not a coincidence, by the way, that the last president to write his own speeches, most of them, was actually Herbert Hoover. From FDR onward, you have people doing that for you, because you're doing that stuff. I mean, experts do it for you. It's also not a coincidence that the first person to take all of his papers and found a new presidential library out of them was Herbert Hoover, because you have the government's now producing so much more paper because it's doing so much more stuff. And FDR, of course, also expanded the range and power of the presidency by making the president the central focal point of media publicity and the person who is responsible for initiating legislation. As we'll see, however, this is the beginning of this process. What really will turn the administrative state in the United States into a leviathan is actually the Cold War. And then finally, the last legacy of the New Deal is that they reshape liberalism in the United States. New Deal social welfare liberalism is an idea that instead of letting people fall and stand on their own efforts, it's an ideology that a powerful national bureaucracy is there to ensure the freedom from insecurity. That's the way I'm putting it, basically. That's what liberalism means. That's what you need to be free from, or free for, free to enjoy the things, because that's really what people, it's almost as much psychological as economic and physical. Because again, most people weren't starving during the Depression, but it's freeing people from the fluctuations of the market and the devastating effects it can have. That is his legacy. For the first time, Americans experienced the federal government as a part of their everyday lives through all these initiatives. And it's a change that has never been undone and probably can never be undone at this point. He also, of course, creates, again, a new political spectrum, because now, again, now you have on the one end this Democratic Party, which is a coalition of ethnic groups, city dwellers, organized labor, African Americans, and a cross-section of the middle class, which will form the backbone of the Democratic coalition for decades to come. And so, yeah, and so this new deal, it initiates a it's sort of like well, that's the title of my lecture, New Deal, New Republic. It pushes the Republic in a very different direction. Above all, he did change Americans' attitudes about government, about their lives. That is as important as anything, the meaning and nature of the Republic itself. And I should mention, by the way, you'll find in your textbook, they have some nice primary sources of letters that were written to Roosevelt by older people, especially, who hated what he did. He was not universally popular. So it wasn't like everyone was totally on board with this. But for the most part, most people accepted, and a lot of people embraced this stuff. And he did it with that sort of, as I mentioned earlier, that great optimism, but also that little bit of a rosy outlook on the country. He once told Francis Perkins, who was his labor secretary, in a letter that he said, quote, "We are going to make a country in which no one is left out," unquote. Now, to me, if you take that statement literally, that's a kind of utopian idea, because somebody's always left out of these things. But both for good and ill, this aspiration that the New Deal represented has left its society, left its mark on our society and its politics ever since. So that is a lecture on the New Deal. Hopefully, guys will get something out of it before for our next discussion. Maybe it'll help you if you look at it, take a look at your writing critique. So good luck on the readings, and I will see you guys in discussion. Take care.